make your funnel clear and frictionless. I'd like to define first, what is a funnel? We hear this all the time. Give us the basics.
Yeah, the basics are this is how we begin to attract people to a final outcome, right? So the funnel is starting with, where do we begin talking to these people? Once we start talking, what do the interactions look like? So once there's interactions, what are the actions that start to happen, right? Where are we able to take people? So let's say we start with paid search and we catch their attention with a paid search ad. They click on the ad. They're now in our funnel, right? They're now moving closer and closer towards that final outcome that we want to drive them to. Sometimes that's a sale. Sometimes that's some sort of intermediate action, like just signing up for something or joining us at a webinar. So it depends. So you can have a macro funnel, which is, how do we generally make people aware that we exist? How do we attract them into our hemisphere? And then how do we get them to buy stuff? And then there's a lot of little funnels that exist within that to create micro actions or micro sales and lots of other stuff. So that's what the funnel is. It's amazing to me. And look, I've gotten this wrong so many times. Like it's amazing how easy it is to get this wrong, right? I've gotten it wrong far more often than I've gotten it right in terms of making it clear and frictionless. I go back and I'll look at a funnel that I've spent some time on. I evaluate a lot of other people's funnels. And so often the first thing that you feel when you show up at somebody's sales funnel is, go away. It's just like they make it. There's a lot of friction. There's a lot of misunderstanding. There's clunky language. There's jargon. There's so many things we can do to screw this up. And I think it stems from a desire to try to be far too comprehensive, try to say too much. Right? I very rarely see founders saying too little. They're almost always saying way too much. They're like, but they need to know, but it does this and it does that and it does this and it does that. It's like, remind yourself, this isn't an hour-long infomercial where somebody's bored to tears and can't sleep and they're going to sit there for an hour and you've got 4 or 5 seconds to catch people's attention. And then every 2 to 3 seconds, you got to keep re-earning that attention. So keep things simple, keep things streamlined, say less. And look, at the beginning, at the top level of this thing, when we're first thinking about like, where does that funnel begin? It starts with awareness, right? And so when we think about those early actions and activities in sales and marketing, I'm always trying to optimize for awareness, right? I've got to get their attention. Could be through ads, could be through content, could be through partnerships, but we have to have something that makes them aware of that we exist, right? And not just that we exist, but we exist in a context that matters to them. And then it comes down to like, there's lots of technical stuff in here. I want to flip over to Jay Dee in a second because he's a consummate sales guy and teaches this stuff day in, day out. And so I think his input on what really makes a clear and frictionless sales funnel is going to be super important. But it's little things, right? Like removing distractions, make your CTA clear, your call to action clear. Try to only have one, right? Nothing worse than showing up on a website where they're calling me to action like 20 or 30 different ways. Right? I'm already a father of 3. If I wanted to be distracted by conflicting interests, I could talk to my kids, right? You want to sell me something, you want to get me to take a specific action, give me one to take, right? And then always make sure, like the other thing that I see routinely, one of the big fails for early stage startups is that they don't nurture people who don't convert immediately. They don't try hard enough to keep people in the funnel. They're sort of like, well, we took our shot. We hit them with an ad. We put them on a landing page. They gave us an email, they went to the checkout page, they didn't buy anything, damn, we'll try again tomorrow, all right? But they don't circle back around. They're not retouching the same people. And so I think that's the other like critical mistake that I see in terms of not making the funnel clear and frictionless.
Okay, but hang on for a second because I want to ask JD, let's get into explicitly what funnels might look like, especially looking at the audience that we have. I can imagine all different types of funnels. They're not always the same. But if I said my funnel, and this is the funnel that I use, and I basically build around all my social media and building my digital footprint out there, I want them to know me, like me, trust me, and then buy from me. So I have a 4-stage, and that's generally how I think about it, and I've got content and I do different things at every stage, and slowly it squeezes to the point where the smallest percent will actually buy from me. Is that a funnel? Like, am I on the right track if I start thinking that way as a founder?
So everyone's funnel, as you said, is going to look a bit different, but we've all seen the picture of the kind of the upside down or the V-shaped, right? Very wide at the top of funnel. We're trying to get lots and lots of prospects into that. As you said, Ed, we're going to move them through whatever number of steps there are, and everybody's number of steps may be different, may look different, but trying to move them through their buying cycle, our sales cycle, to squeeze those revenue generating customers off the bottom. And they don't all look the same for sure. You might have a 3 or 4 step funnel. You could have a 10 or 12 step funnel. It's really dependent on that company and the process and the steps they need in there.
Give me an example for a second. Like, let's really make it explicit so founders can imagine. So give me an example of some steps of funnels that you've created or helped create for founders, JD.
Yeah, sure. So let's say you're doing some kind of outreach, cold outreach, right? And somebody replies to an email, replies to a linked message, answers a phone call, a cold call, whatever it may be. That may be the entry point for them into your funnel. Some activity has been taken by your prospects, so they're now in your funnel. Now we want to move them through the funnel. So can we move that phone call or that email reply to a meeting? That's then maybe the next step in the funnel. They go from kind of active reply to a meeting step of the funnel. We get to the meeting, we have a conversation. Maybe they want to see a demo. That could be the third step of the funnel. Is a demo. Now, from the demo, what's next? Is it a letter of intent to buy? Is it some kind of action to actually buy? Or is there another step that may move them closer to a purchase? But those are what some of the steps will look like as we're moving them from a prospective client all the way through to a closed won deal, somebody who's giving you money, paying you money for whatever solution you offer, and then closing them out of the funnel.
Right.
Again, the steps will look all totally different.
Ryan, what's an example from you in your experience? Give an example of a funnel so
Sure.
founders can imagine it.
Let me do a really detailed one, and this is one that some of the audience is going to resonate with because it's probably how they ended up here. Right? So let me talk about how we do this. So it's interesting. So JD, you referenced cold email or cold outreach, and one of the things that I've realized with all of the different tools that we have available to us at this point, cold outreach becomes and I know you weren't suggesting like is the first choice. This isn't me saying like you're wrong. This is me just picking up on that and saying,
yeah,
I've come to this new philosophy where I only use cold outreach if I can't find that person somewhere else where I can warm them up. Right. So it becomes like if I just legitimately cannot discover where this person hangs out, any other means of getting in front of them in some other way first, then cold. So let me tell you about the way that we're using the warm-up funnel now. So it's a couple layered funnel. We'll use LinkedIn because it's one of the best places to execute this. We'll keep it B2B. So starts with that awareness content, right? Ed, you said some smart words before around, I want them to like me, I want them to know me, I want them to understand what I stand for. That first layer does this stuff, right? So typically it'll be some mix of inspirational content, informational content, and a little bit of something I would call more like thought leadership. And I know that that's a term that bands about. What do I actually mean by that? Something that indicates to people how I think, right? So not just the things that I say that are helpful, but also how I feel about certain things, how I think about a process, not just here's my process. So typically a couple of pieces of content from each one of those in a top layer. That gets published organically, then it gets turned into sponsored content by the company page just because that's the way LinkedIn works. From that point, anybody that interacts with that, which is a very specific thing on LinkedIn, add interaction means they liked it, they reacted to it, they commented on it, they clicked read more, they saved it, they shared it. I think that's what constitutes all the ad interactions. That gets them put into a retargeting audience, right? The retargeting layer, I will do exactly the same thing. Right. So I will just show them more of that same type of content, different 9 pieces of content probably, but very similar philosophy. When they interact with that content, it moves them to another retargeting. This is now where we get to kind of mid funnel. So let's go back to the funnel. So this is upper funnel. I want to know who I am. I want to recognize my face, understand a little bit of what I stand for, how I help people, what I do, and inspire them to want to do some of the same stuff. All that happened up there. Mid funnel, now I want something that's going to bring them a little bit closer. I want something that's got a little bit of friction. They've got to do a thing to get a thing. Maybe they need to comment on a post to get an ebook or a calculator that I've built. Maybe it's a free webinar. Maybe it's just a recorded video, something along those lines. But they've got to give me something, typically an email address, sometimes just a comment, something that makes them lean in a little bit further, a little more friction, so they now have taken action. That layer then moves down to the bottom of the funnel. Once they've done that, again, the beauty of this funnel is that I know what they've interacted with at that point. I don't have to wonder by the time that person's shown up at my webinar if they've ever heard a thing I've said before, because they have to have reacted to at least 2 of my posts at a minimum. They get to the webinar, leave the webinar. Maybe there's a CTA there that brings them further into my funnel, but I won't leave that to chance. I will retarget them again on LinkedIn with a lead form ad and a conversation ad, which is where it inboxes them. Why? Because now, by the time I'm asking them to do something more specific and take a bigger action, I have created awareness. I've created some affinity. I've probably done something that feels like help to them. And so by the time I get down to making that ask of, hey, you want to jump on a call, or hey, you want to book with one of our team, hey, you want to buy something, they've had a chance to understand how invested I am in the overall process and how much I care about their outcome. This completely changes that. By the way, I have tons of data on this if anyone wants to talk about it at some point in terms of how that fundamentally changed, because we used to just start with lead form ads. Worked okay. Works way better at a much lower cost now because I'm doing more work up front to help these people understand what it is that we really do and bring them into the funnel in a much warmer way.
That's the perfect segue. You said it. Thank you. Because I know what is going on in founders' minds right now. They just heard you talk about like 5-6-step funnel. JD mentioned a 10-step funnel. And so many of our founders are at that stage where they're just starting and it's like, oh my God, this is so overwhelming. So I'm going to break this down. So first, we got to figure out what the step 1 of the funnel is. So how do you actually start warming that funnel up and loading people into that funnel? And I want to ask a few questions and both of you can jump in. So this comes from us from the chat. So to load the funnel up, you got to know your customer. And so the question was, can you characterize the difference between picking the demographic and interest versus knowing that your customer really is interested in your product enough to pay for it? How do you do that? That's a very common challenge.
I think that it's a bit like asking you to describe someone versus telling me how they think or feel. Who's Ryan? Ryan's a startup founder. He's an expat. He's a soccer player. He does jujitsu. Cool. That's a description of me. So that's the demographic stuff, right? That's that segmentation that we can use to go out and find them somewhere. This helps us understand, like, maybe where do they hang out? What type of stuff do they read? What problems do they have? Where do they live? How much money do they make? What kind of education do they have? Cool. That's all great. Doesn't tell me enough about how does Ryan feel about some context around, like, so let's just say you guys are going to offer me a better fitness tracker, right? So you got to understand a bit about who I am and how I think. You know where to reach me based on that description, right? The descriptive characteristics. But when we get into then the how do I think, how do I feel, what makes me care about this particular problem that you want to solve, that stuff is where we really start to know the customer, right? There's a big difference between knowing who someone is and knowing what they're about. And I think for me, that's the distinction that answers the question that was asked.
Anything to add, JD?
I was going to say, so, and I'm curious to get Ryan your answer on this. How would you go about, reaching out? You have a prospective audience out there. You don't know how they feel about things. Where are you going to go learn that? Or what's the most efficient route you've found to get to that information?
Yep. So let's talk about two things: efficiency and effectiveness. One of my favorite topics in startup land. So there's a very efficient way of doing this. I normally will hold up a copy of the mom test book at this point because this is the process that I would go through. It's going to be customer interviews. There's two ways that we get to some of this information, really. There's probably more than that, but we'll stick with these two. The first one is very efficient, and that would just be going out and looking at existing conversation amongst your target population. So can I find where they're talking about this on Reddit, right? Here's why I'm not happy with my Whoop strap, right? This is why you need to sell me a better fitness strap. I'm actually quite happy with my Whoop strap. Don't take this the wrong way, Will. I'm very happy with my Whoop strap. If I wasn't, right? So then I'm going to be out talking about it on Reddit, maybe a forum somewhere, maybe directly on the Whoop's website, right? Where I can start to see what are people saying? What are the conversations I can take part in without having to take part in a conversation, right? So how can I do customer interview by proxy, right? So this is one of the ways. It's very efficient. I don't find it to be as effective, but it's a great starting point. It helps me to understand the questions that are clearly out there, helps me to understand how people are thinking about it and what other people are answering, right? So it's because there's a dialogue that's existing out there. And so I begin with that process where it's just a bit of the research. And then it's all about picking up the phone, picking up the Zoom, getting people directly engaged and asking them about their problems, not pitching your solution, right? There's an entire episode that we did that covers the book and the process around the mom test. So definitely worth a listen and great book, worth a read. Grab it. It's $12 and 126 pages, not long. So well worth doing. That process of getting in touch with people and really understanding the language they use, how they feel, what they've already tried, why it still fell short, without asking them to predict the future and say, would you use this? Would you try this? Would you pay this amount for that thing? Asking people to predict the future is a waste of time. But we covered that in ad nauseum in that other episode. That would be where I would start. It's really around customer interview and just having horse's mouth level feedback around what needs to happen.
So I was going to say, there's a great story that aligns with what Ryan's talking about from the early days of Salesforce, right? We all know Salesforce, a mildly successful company, you might say, that owns like half of downtown San Francisco, where it seems where I live. So in the very early days, they had a CMO, I believe the very first CMO of Salesforce, named Aaron Ross. I forget his background, but successful guy. Marc Benioff came to him and said, hey, I want to go out and do some customer visits with you. So in the book that he wrote called Predictable Revenue, Aaron talked about, I was having the great one. Marc was going to come with me and I was going to get a master class in selling. That's what he expected. He takes Marc along on a number of customer visits, and all Marc did was ask questions. Hey, what do you need from a product like this? What would help you? What would help you be better? What things can we build into this? He did nothing but customer interviews and gained a mountain of valuable information that then helped them make Salesforce better. So there's a million stories like that. But that's a bit of a high-profile one that comes to mind. And you're totally right.
Perfect illustration.
Let me push this even further because, again, recognizing the founders that are in our audience, I think that you both would advocate for the approach. What I like to do is I don't even talk. At first, I go like what you said, Ryan. This is the reason I'm trying to hack Reddit and get really good at Reddit, because I found it to be a treasure trove of customer discovery. So I will literally just scan and read and lurk and get a feel for what everybody's complaining about, what are the common themes, and then I go and ask a really dumb question, and I'll say, hey, I heard this is the regular thing that people do, and this is how they make decisions, and I heard this is frustrating, and I'm experiencing this problem too, and I'll pretend I'm one of these people saying something dumb, and then Reddit jumps all over me and says, you're stupid, here's how it works, and then they just start talking to me, and then I'll respond, and then sometimes, you know what happens? People will message me directly and say, hey, I had this issue too, and I'll be like, can I interview you? Can I ask you? So that's literally the first step, is go where the customers are talking about it, listen to them, and then that will give you the intelligence on how to enter that market. And then if you collect demographic information along the way, that's great. You may find a common theme. Oh, these are all what we call dinks, dual income, no kids, right? Okay, dinks tend to have, I'm sorry for being crass, tend to have the same type of problem that everybody else has. And so we've talked about that. And so you can combine the two together. But first, the social listening, I think, is something that founders don't do enough.
It's an overlooked one, right? So very frequently as a founder, we end up like thinking about a problem, right? And then we just jump to the solution. We get so caught up in like, what could I do? What could I build? How could I do it? That we forget that there's just a bunch of people out there that eventually we need to go and sell to anyways, that we want to use our product, that we want to change the lives of, that we want to achieve value for. And we forget that they're already sitting out there, right? And that we should just go and talk to them and understand how they feel about it. And look, you can get a lot done with research. You can get a lot done on the whiteboard. But when you need then to turn the corner and start to market to this audience, when you've had those conversations, you know where the emotional triggers are. You see what makes people lean in. You see what makes people lean back. You see where they raise their eyebrows or let out a long sigh. You start to tap into something that's at a completely different level. It's the same reason why people ask me, well, could we just use surveys to ask these questions? You could. This goes back to efficiency versus effectiveness. It's a very efficient way of getting answers, but it is not an effective way of getting insight, in my opinion, because you miss so many things. I've told the anecdote before where I was building something and sent out a survey, sort of querying on the problem, and the problem that people had, they answered in a way that aligned with exactly what I wanted to go build. So then I decided to start building the thing, launch the MVP, put it back out to the same people that said, yes, I have this problem. No, I'm not happy with the solutions, whatever. And then it was like, okay, great. So these people are going to pick this up in droves. Everybody will love this. Instead, no one was using it. I couldn't figure out why. Like, why was there no take rate from 100 people who had all answered in a pattern and within the survey that indicated this would be a perfectly fit for them? So I drank my own Kool-Aid, picked up the phone, started talking to some of these folks. It was actually, Zoom or probably Skype. This is a few years back. And what I found out was, yes, they had this problem. No, they weren't satisfied with the incumbent solutions to it, but they were so frustrated with the platform this was associated with, they didn't even want to try to fix it. They were just like, I just want it to go away. I don't want to work harder. I don't want a solution to it. I just don't want to use it anymore, right? And so had I asked those questions, but the answer to the question was, are you using this tool? Yes. Are you frustrated with this aspect of it? Yes. If it did this, would you be happier? Yes. Question I didn't ask was, are you so frustrated you want to leave this platform altogether and not invest more time in it? But I would have seen that, because on the phone, when it's like, are you still using this platform? Yeah. Right? That tells you something. On a survey, that's still coded as yes. Yeah, with the long sigh and the angry voice tells you something very different than yes. Right? So we got to be careful anytime we aim for efficiency that we're not somehow stomping all over the effectiveness of what comes out the other side.
That's perfect. Let me ask you both some bullet round questions to make this very tactical for our founders. So, JD, a founder comes to you and says, hey, what do? You explain to him, and then says, well, I need to do this myself. I'm a shoestring budget. I am starting from ground zero, and I need to build a sales funnel. And I heard you. I listened to Ryan, and he said, make it clear and frictionless. I get it, but where do I start? What's the first thing that you would tell that founder to do?
Well, first, I want to make sure they understand who their audience is or who they think their audience is, right? And we want to try to drill down into that and make sure their audience is who it should be. And then they're going to need a platform of some sort of CRM or a sales engagement platform to put this information into and track it and work with it. And then, we start testing their theory, their thesis. Is this, is your audience really who you think your audience is? Let's get them, like Ryan said, let's pick up a phone and call them. Let's reach out over email, LinkedIn, X, whatever it may be. Let's engage with these people, ask some questions, and do some learning. It's kind of like what Marc Benioff did on those sales calls. Get out there and ask some questions and validate that who you think is your audience, that they have the problem you think they have. To Ryan's point, that they want to solve the problem, and then start figuring out your solution and how best to approach other people who might spend money with you to solve that problem.
You're saying start off with a thesis. This is what I've researched, what I know about my customer, but you still have to test that thesis doing something. And the shortest way is just hand-to-hand combat, just get in there, pick up the phone, call them.
Yeah, engage. Yeah, because I've seen it. I'm sure we've all seen this. A number of early stage startups who say, my customer is XYZ. They name an industry, a role, a function. They get out there in the real world, and it turns out they were completely 180 degrees off of who they thought they were selling to. So yeah, you got to test it. Before you spend a lot of effort and money, test your thesis.
Okay, Ryan, what would you say do first, or add to what JD said?
Let's just add. So I think that where I see, like, let's take that steps and steps and steps further, right? In terms of like the narrowing down, right? They often pick a segment. Sometimes it fails because they picked the wrong segment. More often what I see is they fail because the segment that they picked was just too wide. They weren't descriptive enough, right? We have a SaaS solution that helps B2B companies. Where that can start to fail, now that may be absolutely what you do, and that may eventually end up working as messaging. But in the beginning, sometimes we just need to be so much more specific, right? We help B2B companies who sell into the biomed space. The more specific we can get, right? Because when we know exactly who we're talking to, we know what to say. Because if I'm going to talk to a B2B platform that sells data analytics to biomed, right? The way I'm going to approach that conversation versus the way I would approach that if I'm talking to a B2B founder that sells into, I don't know, pick something else, retail checkout optimizations. Okay. Extremely different. Now, my solution may work for both of those founders, but if I just say I help B2B founders with this thing, or I have a SaaS product for these B2B founders, I don't necessarily know you're talking to me. If I'm biomed or I'm e-commerce retail optimizer, I don't necessarily see myself reflected in that. And so I think the thing I'm always encouraging people to do is just narrow and narrow and narrow and narrow until the messaging that you use cannot possibly be ignored by the people you're trying to talk to, because it's so specific, right? Like if somebody were to shout, I think I did this a couple days ago on maybe the last session, but somebody shouts, "Hey, you," right? All four of us might look, but not really care to react. Somebody screams, "Hey, Baldy," unless anybody's assuming that Jen's not hiding hair under that hat, they're probably talking to me. Right. And so I'm going to be like, what? Right? So we want to make sure that when we send out messaging, it's not easily ignorable. So much of what founders send out, both in terms of direct messaging, the stuff that goes on the website, is just so easily ignored. And that's because they're trying to speak to far too many people at once. So narrow it down, narrow it down, narrow it down. So I would say, JD, you're absolutely right in terms of like, you need to make sure you're talking to the right people. But I'm going to add some nuance to that, which is to say that sometimes the reason we miss that isn't that we miss the entire pool, but we're talking just too broadly to that segment. When we go way deeper and way more narrow, that we start to resonate.
Yeah, and if I could add on to that, so
Yeah.
to add some kind of practical stuff to this, if you, as you know, as a founder, right, when you start looking out and trying to find your audience out there in the world, and there are these things generally known as B2B contact databases. There's called sales intelligence platforms, but nobody uses that terminology. You go into a Zoom Info, an Apollo, a database like that. If you have a very wide audience, you start searching and filtering for that wide audience, you could literally get tens of millions of results.
Yep.
That's completely unmanageable, right? So you start to filter and niche down, whether it's by geography, company size, job titles, whatever it may be, you can start to get an actually manageable list of people, whether it's a few hundred or a couple thousand. But you want to niche down to that really manageable list and then start from there. Start to build your business, and you figure it out, and then you can start to scope back up.
Say that again, but louder, JD, please. Like it's spot on.